Hello and welcome. You found the Social Work Podcast. My name's Jonathan Singer, and I'll be your host as we explore all things social work. Today's episode of the Social Work Podcast is the audio recording of a Facebook Live discussion that happened on Tuesday, July 14th, 2020, called Both and, or Either or, Social Work and Policing. Following the murder of George Floyd on May 25th, 2020, and the murders of countless other black people by police over the past 200 plus years, two perspectives emerged about social work's role with law enforcement. Now, to be sure, these perspectives have been articulated for years, but in the midst of the largest and most sustained period of protests against systemic racism and support for Black lives, these two perspectives gained particular traction after social work leaders published opinion pieces on Medium.com. The either-or perspective, articulated by UCLA social work chair Laura Abrams and University of Houston social work dean Alan Dettlaff in June 18, 2020, in an open letter to NASW and allied organizations, argued that, quote, social work can either continue to invest in and collaborate with police or affirm that Black lives matter. Now, this letter was signed by over 1,400 social workers, and in full transparency, I was one of the signatories, and it was delivered to NASW. The both and perspective was articulated in a Medium.com post on June 30th, 2020 by Darlene Bailey, Charles E. Lewis Jr., Steve Burkhart, and Terry Mizrahi. They argued that, quote, we need to break from binary slogans of defunding and replace them with a transformative platform tied to reinvesting in social services, training guardians, not warriors, and ending all forms of racial injustice in law enforcement, sentencing, incarceration, parole, and probation. The links to both of those are on the Social Work Podcast website. Now, these and subsequent publications prompted a dynamic and at times contentious debate among social workers on Twitter. Now, I was impressed with how many people were engaged and with many of the points that people were making and the resources that they were sharing. I was also frustrated because Twitter isn't designed for discussions, and I was talking with my social work colleague at Loyola University Chicago, Michael Kelly, and he suggested that I invite the authors to do a podcast, and it might surprise you that I had not considered doing a podcast. But then I realized that the thing that I was looking for was a way for folks to engage with the authors of these pieces. And as much as I love podcasts, you can't really engage in real time with them. So I realized a Facebook Live might be the perfect compromise. It would allow the authors to share their perspectives while the audience engaged with content and each other on the live feed. So I reached out to the authors, and I was grateful that Alan, Laura, Charles, and Terry said yes. So my guests for this Facebook Live were Charles E. Lewis Jr., who is the founder and president of the Congressional Research Institute for Social Work and Social Policy, Terry Mizrahi. She's currently the co-chair with Professor Mimi Abramovitz of the National Social Work Voter Mobilization Campaign. That's socialworkvotes.org. She's also a founding member of ACOSA, the Association of Community Organizing and Social Action, and until recently was a professor at the Silberman School of Social Work at Hunter College, as well as past president of NASW. As I mentioned, Alan Dettlaff is dean at the University of Houston, and Laura Abrams is the department chair in the Department of Social Work at UCLA. I want to give a big shout out to Charla Yearwood. She's a clinical assistant professor of field instruction and coordination at IUPUI for volunteering to create a transcript and closed captioning for the recording. Charla, your speed and generosity made the video accessible for the deaf and hard of hearing community and ADA compliant for professors who wanted to assign this discussion to their students. Now, Charla's Twitter tag is available on the Social Work Podcast website. I recommend following her on Twitter. She shares amazing content on a regular basis. about social justice, racial justice, and the social work profession. Now, there are multiple ways to experience this discussion. You can read the transcript, watch it on YouTube with closed captions, or immerse yourself in over 500 audience questions, comments, and resources posted on the Facebook Live. And all of the links and transcripts can be found at socialworkpodcast.com. Now, a few notes about this episode. The audio is pulled from the live video feed, which means that the audio quality and the volume of each speaker's varies. During the live stream, I was moderating the conversation, messaging with the guests, keeping track of the comments and questions on Facebook, and occasionally responding online. And this means that you'll hear me say and a little bit more often than I like to when I'm doing a podcast. Before the live feed, my guests and I agreed that Laura would start with a brief description of the either-or perspective. Charles would do the same for the both-and perspective, and then Alan and Terry would have time to respond and go into more depth about these two perspectives. And now, without further ado, on to episode 127 of the Social Work Podcast, Both and or Either or, Social Work and Policing. I would just like to welcome you and thank you for being part of today's conversation. And I would like to start by asking Laura to take a couple of minutes to describe this either or position.
Thank you, Jonathan, and all my colleagues. I think just want to start by saying it's very important that we have this conversation, and I'm very happy to be part of the discussion today. As has been made clear by all of our public statements, I think we all agree that this is a very pivotal time in the history of our profession. And I think we all agree as well that we need to act on many fronts to combat lethal and persistent racism and to reimagine what safety looks like in communities that don't feel protected, especially at the hands of the police. So Jonathan gave you a little bit of background about how Alan and I got involved in this discussion. And so just to reiterate a little bit, on June 15th, NASW responded in the Washington Post to a critical article that was written from a non-social worker about how social workers are basically just as racist as police officers. So we were not the solution to policing issues. NASW responded in a way that suggested that social workers are best suited to work alongside the police, and that was the gist of the opinion. 2 days later, Trump signed an executive order on policing that was sorely insufficient and highly criticized by Black Lives Matter and grassroots organizations. That evening, NASW put out a tweet showcasing a photo of Trump that appeared to support the executive order. And they tweeted, quote, "At real Donald Trump, sign an executive order calling for more police training. Hashtag social workers will be integral." In this kind of enthusiastic way about this is social work's moment, and even aligning in that sense with Trump. Now, NASW later denounced the executive order, but that tweet was still felt far and wide, both among social workers, our students, our community. And it hit me kind of hard. I've been listening to the voices of our students that are calling for more progressive and grassroots responses that want us to support the Black Lives Matter platform and the People's Budget. And I felt extremely concerned at that moment that we were moving in the wrong direction, and that as our governing organization, that NASW was not representing the multitude of voices in our profession. So I spoke with Alan that day, and we decided to use our platform as deans and directors and to put ourselves out there and asking NASW to take a bolder stance, one that stands in support of those leading the movement in the Black community, which may not be social workers, but is such a critical voice right now. And just to reiterate, our 5 points that we asked for was for NASW to, one, endorse the Black Lives Matter policy platform, to craft a policy position on what divesting from police and reinvesting communities might mean for social work, to add an anti-racism code of ethic to our code, to acknowledge that there are abolitionist voices among our members so that NASW doesn't have just one type of voice, and to address our own history of white supremacy and racism. And over 1,100 people signed our open letter just in 5 days over Twitter, and we were really enthusiastic. So just let me be clear to summarize in my opening statement. For Alan and I, our position is that defunding the police is a key element in moving toward an anti-racist society, one that is way overdue, and that reinvesting in critical services, basic needs, and prevention is also anti-racist. We think divest and reinvest should be part of our national social work agenda. We think it aligns with our values. And this is why we decided to use our own positions to make our voices heard. We do not speak for our faculty or all of our constituents, but we are committed to moving this discourse forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. And before I turn to Charles, I just wanted to, again, thank everybody who's watching and invite you to leave your comments and questions in the chat box. And we will do our best to entertain as many as possible later on after folks have had a chance to elaborate a little bit more on their position. So, Charles.
Thank you, Jonathan. And I'm delighted to be here with my colleagues to talk about this very important subject, and that is reducing the harm that policing has had in so many communities, particularly communities of color. I want to preface my remarks by saying I'm not here to defend NASW. I'm here to give my own viewpoints on this. Some of you may have had the opportunity to see our congressional briefing on the 30th of June, where we brought together some people who operate in that space, as we like to call it, to show that there's multiple ways that you can operate in communities. I say in tandem. That doesn't mean in partnership necessarily, side by side or in different. But the one thing is we have to remember is that Black communities and no communities are monolithic. There are so many different communities that there is no one size fits all approach, and people have different attitudes. I am sure that older African Americans have a much different attitude and opinion than a lot of the young people who are, marching with Black Lives Matters. But we all have the same objective, and that is to end the brutality that happens in our communities on a daily basis by police. So I am looking forward to having a spirited discussion.
Thank you so much, Charles. And again, what we're doing here is Alan is going to provide a little bit more commentary on the either or, and then I'm going to go to Terry for a little more on the both and. And again, thank you for your comments. I'm seeing them. I'm seeing lots of folks that are our friends and colleagues on the Facebook Live, so this is wonderful. Shout out to all of you. Alan.
Yes, thanks. First, I want to, as Laura mentioned, really thank Darlene and Terry and Charles and Steve for their response to our letter, which articulated this both and idea, because that's what really got the discussion going and has continued. But I wanted to elaborate a bit with why we think a both and response is not appropriate for our profession and why we have advocated for what's called this either or approach. And I think it comes down to really the acknowledging that we've already had a both and approach when it comes to social work and policing. We have been collaborating with law enforcement for decades, and it really has not led to very meaningful change in the sense that we continue to see the same racist, violent outcomes that come out of law enforcement, despite our collaborations with them. I think we've tried to view ourselves as the people who can create change from inside, but I think now is a time where we need to acknowledge that we've tried to collaborate, we've tried to reform, and at this point we're complicit. And we believe that we can't continue to be complicit in what we know to be harmful racist institutions. So that's why we said in our response, we don't believe this is a both and moment, because cooperating with a racist institution equates to upholding that institution. I think we also, when we talk about collaborations with police, I think we need to acknowledge that social workers are already not viewed as helpful by many communities of color, due primarily to our role in family separation, which is done disproportionately in Black communities. And if we think about who we want to be as social workers and as a profession, if we want to be helpful, if we want to provide helpful services to communities, a big part of that is building trust. And building the trust we need to build in communities is already a really delicate balance, because in many communities, social workers are already viewed as a form of policing. So when we think about collaborating with police, our view is that we can't build trust in communities, we can't be effective in responding to situations if we are walking into communities hand in hand with the very people who've been terrorizing those communities for decades. So we believe we need to discontinue any form of collaboration with law enforcement. And then, as Laura articulated, the Black Lives Matter movement has organized around a platform to defund the police. And we believe that we as a profession need to stand with them. So our either or approach stated that social work can either continue to invest in and collaborate with police, or we can affirm that Black Lives Matter. And the way to do that is supporting the Black Lives Matter platform to defund the police. We do believe, as Charles and Terry's letter mentioned, that we need to take away from one to gain in another. Your letter called for reinvesting in social services. Where will those funds come from? We believe that can come by reallocating the billions of dollars that are currently spent on policing. And then lastly, I wanted to say, I think it's important to think about some of the bigger picture issues that this conversation leads to or should be leading us to. I think this movement or this discussion is really important because these bigger picture questions, when we think about who's best equipped to respond to mental health crises, and we've had discussions about whether that should be the police or whether social workers should take that role or whether social workers should collaborate with the police. I think the real question that we need to be asking ourselves is, why are there so many mental health crises that require a response? Why do we live in a society in which so many people have unmet mental health needs that get to the point of escalating to a crisis? And is there something that we as a society can do about that? And the answer to that is yes. This is about how we as a society choose to allocate our resources. Right now, we choose to spend billions of dollars on a system of policing to respond to mental health crises, instead of spending those billions of dollars to prevent those crises from happening in the first place. So what if we thought about that differently? So to me, that's what this movement is really about. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Alan. So much food for thought there. So I just want to dive right in. Terry, I'm going to hand it over to you, though, for a little bit more context for the both and perspective. Thank you.
Okay, so it really has started that difference. I don't know whether we call it a debate, because once Alan talked about institutions, that there are systemic racism in institutions, that will put our frame. So we're here today, even before Laura's comment, or the Black Lives Matter response to George Floyd and the others. But here's the moment. We are in a media moment where social work has gotten the spotlight. For some people, that's wonderful, and other people it's scary, and other people are saying, oh no. So, when we say both and, we don't mean, that there's two positions as opposed to one. But we are being identified as part of the solution. And Alan's right. We have been criticized for years as part of the problem. If somebody is giving you an opportunity to be part of the solution, let's take advantage of this opportunity, because they are recognizing, and who they are, we can talk about later, who's saying this, in the skills. We have some skills, we have some values, I hope so. I've devoted my whole life to thinking that social workers can make a difference, and that leadership makes a difference, and people on the line can. So the either or, again, people who ran to, yes, let's embrace the opportunity, and then people said reject it, and that's what our colleagues basically are saying today. And if I misinterpret something along the way, I'm just going to say, as we inferred from your comments, and we may not be exactly exactly correct, but we absolutely believe that you can be both critics and collaborators, and those are not passive roles. Those we can and need to be at the table where policy is happening, and at the door where protest is happening. And that's how movements are made. You start with the protest, and then you get to the policy. Without the protest, we would have not had the civil rights movement, we all agree. But without the bills and the legislation that got passed, we wouldn't have the civil rights where we are today, as limited as that is. So I want to say something about a couple last things. The either or strategy does make people take sides. And it feeds the divide and conquer strategy right now against those who are against systemic reform, those who are against Black Lives Matter, those who deny that systematic racism exists. Just look at the commercials now on television, but what defund the police is saying on the folks who don't believe what I know we all believe, and those probably on this, everybody watching and listening today. But today is a discussion not of systemic racism so much, but it's about having committed, confident social workers on the inside, sharing their practices, providing the services. And as we continue to be critics, we stand and speak out in public forums and be critical. I'm not sure why we can't and shouldn't and have to do both to make a difference and for our profession. Last comments for now, and we'll come back. I want to say something about acknowledging institutional racism, which Alan did, in all agencies. So police departments are the smallest, I think, the smallest departments in terms of social workers. But we are the systemic racism in child welfare, in healthcare that's been exposed by the pandemic. The disparities are huge. The school system, no system is just. So we must acknowledge that thousands of social workers already work in collaboration with the police, and more importantly, in criminal justice. So our position, as we read in the last statement by our colleagues, is not to call for a boycott of agencies, to say that field placements students should not be placed in field, to allow students to have the opportunity, or to say you can reject going into that. Where is the slippery slope? How far does that go? Should we not have field placements in child welfare because African-American folks and people of color get a worse treatment? Should we not have social workers in schools because there are police guarding the doors? Should we not have folks in hospitals when we know that public system is falling apart while the private hospitals get more money from middle-class people? Where does it end? So if we're saying, and this last thing I will say, what the slippery slope does in this either or is we have thousands of folks of color who, I'll speak now, as I said, we want to speak for ourselves, at Silberman School of Social Work, where I've taught for 39 years. And and the people coming in, mainly women coming in to get their degrees, many of them disproportionately are people of color. coming in to professionalize themselves, to make a difference in those systems, take on leadership positions. And who are we to say, boycott those? Don't use student placements. And deans, no longer field directors, allow your students to work in these systems. We all, if you agreed as we started that every system has systemic racism, where do we have our social workers go? And particularly the thousands of African-American social workers that I know, at least in New York City, are working their tails off to change those systems from within. So we need a without, we need to be at the door, we need the table, and I'll add my last comment, we need to be at the polls.
Thank you, Terry. So there's so much to unpack here, and so I'm just going to ask Laura and Alan if you'd like to respond to anything that Charles and Terry have said about their positions. And I just want to say that in the comments on Facebook, one of the requests is to define what does it mean to defund. And so if you could start out with some of the addressing some of these basic definitions and certainly how that relates to your responses, that would be wonderful.
I can talk a little bit about that and
Thanks, Laura.
why I've come to support the call to defund the police. I think a lot of well-meaning white people and that I know and in my family and community have come to me and said, I don't understand the slogan. It's too off-putting. And I think, I saw that in the chat as well. And, because people start to think about, do we, who's going to keep us safe, right? And that is scary for people. But the reason that I really support the defunding the police movement is, first of all, that is the slogan and the cry and the position that the Black Lives Matter has taken, the movement, and people who are day to day affected by violent, lethal policing that has not affected my life as a white woman. So who am I to say, that's not the right slogan or that's not the right pitch? I take a step back from judgment. And in what I have read, and I just wanted to explain a couple of things. Defunding is a continuum of movement toward reimagining what safety means in communities that have not been protected from the police as an agent of violence. When you think about institutional violence, there is no other institution that has been as violent, and Terry mentioned education, healthcare, child welfare. Those are all institutions that have problematic racist components. But there's no institution that has been as lethally violent as policing in America toward the Black community and communities of color. And that's why I do think at this time, while we need to question a lot of where social work stands, focusing on defunding the police is a policy agenda that I strongly believe social work should endorse. And it does matter what our leaders say. And to date, there have not been a public endorsement by NASW or our other leaders on defunding the police or beyond we support Black lives. People have not said, I support the Black Lives Matter policy platform. And that is what Alan and I are asking for, which is to take money out of bloated police departments that have taken over a lot of social work jobs and jobs that community members can do to keep people safe and feel like they can thrive and have healthy lives, and put that money into education and prevention and other resources. I agree with Alan that there are limited resources. And so in asking for social work to join with the police, we're asking for more money to be put into police budgets, which I do not support. And I do not see that leading to any type of change, because decades and decades of decrees and lawsuits and presidential commissions and evidence does not support at all that light reforms work in preventing violence, police violence against Black people. So I'll stop there.
So I'm actually going to jump to you, Charles. I know Alan, I had sort of said Laura and Alan, but there was a lot to unpack there. And Charles, I'm wondering if you have any reflections or comments, because I know that you addressed some of these in one of the pieces that you wrote in terms of both the meaning of defunding and some of the roles of social work.
All right. So I'm a writer, a wordsmith, all right? So words matter. So when you say defund the police, some people interpret that as meaning get rid of the police. In fact, there are some abolitionists out there saying abolish the police, okay? I don't know if I would find a whole lot of African-American people who would agree with that. Now, I'm not speaking for all African-American people. I'm not speaking for all African-American communities. I'm saying that I've lived in some pretty bad communities in my time, and there are times I wanted to see the police, okay? I mean, as long as they weren't coming after me, I felt safer with the police than without the police. It's a very complicated situation. Congresswoman Bass and Senator Van Hollen are crafting a bill now where they would create an entity in the community separate from the police that would handle certain calls. So if 911 calls come in for maybe a nonviolent domestic violence situation or a mental health situation or a homeless situation, then the police would not be involved. I mean, that's just one model. It has been done in, I believe, Albuquerque and Newark now is going to segregate some funds. So I'm for that, in terms of reallocating funds. But in terms of the idea of, totally getting rid of the police, I think that's not practical. I don't think it's going to happen. And but the bottom line is that I'd rather have social workers in this space, okay? Because we bring our values into this work. And yeah, maybe we're not going to be perfect at it, but I bet you we will do a lot more good than we'll do damage. I believe that social workers would be looking out for the people in the community, whether they were, with the police or outside of the police. So I'll just say one last thing. Alan, you know the name Lee P. Brown? Oh, okay. I thought you might know. Lee P. Brown was a police commissioner in Houston, and actually he became mayor following that. But David Dinkins hired him to be his police commissioner in around 1989. And I was living in East New York, Brooklyn, which was one of the worst communities in the city, if not the country. It was called the Killing Fields. I mean, there were so many murders in that community. And so Lee P. Brown instituted a community policing. And he took the police out of the cars, put them on the street, and they had to engage the community. And I was working at a church at the St. Paul Community Baptist Church in that community, which is why I was living on the block, because they had given me a place to stay. But long story short, we had meetings in the church with the police, and we talked about a lot of issues. And what happened is when the community began to lose its complete fear and distrust of the police, they were able to, they felt more willing to point out the bad guys and cooperate in terms of policing. And we saw a major drop in crime in our community. So I'm saying the police, they got a lot of work to do. All right. And certainly social workers are not going to fix the police. But I think social workers need to be in this space, and I think police still have some things that they need to do in terms of keeping us safe from the bad guys.
Thank you. And there are a ton of comments. We have about 25 minutes left on this live stream. And so keep the comments going. We're not going to be able to get to all of them, but I'm loving the fact that there is this conversation happening on the Facebook Live about this content, which is exactly what we need. We need conversation about this. One of the things that I wanted to do is Alan, I wanted to give you an opportunity to respond. And I also wanted to throw out something that I've seen in the thread, which is this conversation, and it gets really down to it's not minutia, but it's very on ground, and it relates to something that Charles said, which is that some folks are wondering, since social workers are expected to go into situations that can be dangerous, and these aren't necessarily black, white, brown. This is not about somebody's skin color, but if there is no relationship with the police and social work, how do we think about social worker safety, and how do we think about the jobs that social workers are trained to do in communities? So, Alan, I'm going to hand that over to you.
Yeah, I think that's an important conversation. And I think, for the most part, the conversations that I've seen of people talking about social workers being more equipped as a responder are responding to nonviolent situations. Mm-hmm. I think in a lot of cases, that's the response that's being talked about, going into nonviolent situations. Yes. But I think we also need to, as a field, part of what Laura and I have talked about is that just because we're trained as social workers, I think we need to acknowledge that that doesn't mean we're not going to continue to see some of the same racist outcomes that we see in policing. The difference is that social workers don't have guns, so we may not see the kind of, we won't see the violent outcomes we've seen. But social work, I think, as our profession, really needs to grapple with the racism that exists within our own profession. And it's something that people are just starting to talk about. We have problems of racism, as Terry mentioned, in our own systems of care. And until we really start to have candid conversations about that, and not just conversations, but action to address it, how do we think we can be a solution to anything in this space? I think you only need to look as far as the child welfare system to know how much harm social workers can cause to children and families of color, and particularly Black children and families. That's the kind of thing that we need to start talking about as a profession. I think I wanted to give a kind of a concrete example of defunding, because I think that I've seen that in the chat, and I'll give you just a quick one of Houston's. Houston's plan to defund the police was to end unfilled positions, so to eliminate unfilled positions in the police department, to suspend overtime pay, and to implement a hiring freeze. That would have saved $30 million that could have been reinvested into the community for mental health services, crisis response, substance abuse, programs. And that's what defund is about. But I wanted to address what Charles said too. I do think this is about a bigger movement that's tied to abolition. For many, many people, defunding the police is a strategy to get towards abolition. And I think it's important that we as a profession start having conversations about what that means. I know that idea seems even more radical, but I think that's where we as a profession need to be, because it's consistent with our values. Putting people in cages shouldn't be the solution to society's problems. We need to start talking more about not just how harmful policing is, but how harmful incarceration is. And when I think about this bigger idea, abolition isn't about just closing police departments. It's about ultimately rendering them obsolete. And that's about what divestment and reinvestment in communities is about. It's about gradually divesting from law enforcement and reallocating those funds to what really creates public safety. Police don't make communities safe. What really makes communities safe is well-funded public schools, access to mental health services, housing for all who need it, employment opportunities, expansion of the safety net. That's what we should be allocating funds for in our communities.
So, can I comment?
Yes, Terry, I was gonna call on you because I know that Alan just raised a bunch of points that you had sort of alluded to earlier about the role of social work in various different fields. So yes, please.
I don't think that we are so, what's the word? I don't think we're so, we believe that social work is going to have the answer. So again, I know Alan didn't say that. If we're going to wait for social work by itself, then where are the nurses? Where are the teachers? Are we, again, I'm just moving that forward to the extreme that Laura and Alan didn't say directly. But we're not telling the doctors. They're working in race assistance, and we didn't tell them to leave, and they would cause just as much death if they didn't work in those systems. And we see the variety of folks working on the line now. So we can, again, do both. That's not a wishy-washy position to say that we need to do both at the same time. We can't wait. But on the other hand, we have to address our code. So I went back to the Code of Ethics. I'm sure all of us did because we're talking about it. And I was pleased with the words. Charles, he talked about words. The words are there. Maybe now they need to be more intentional because one of the values is social justice. And by the way, and again, there may be a lot of younger folks here or older folks who forgot what the code says. And it's one of the tenets that Laura and Alan have suggested. So we can add more explicit language. We could be more intentional. It talks about absolutely making a change from within. We would not have an NASW nationally in 1963 because every single white social worker worked in a segregated system. So we would have 13 states that wouldn't be part of NASW. Maybe some people would think that's good. I want to bring the example of deinstitutionalization. I think we have to be careful here. Many of us here, and many of us I'm sure on the call, supported deinstitutionalization of mental hospitals for 3 or 4 different reasons and talked about transferring those funds from the system, the institution, to the community. What happened? We got rid of one and we didn't get rid of the other. So we need to look at how do we expand the pie for all those services and all those preventive programs in which unheralded social workers are working today. I can tell you that I don't want to speak for folks who are working in those systems because I don't, but I teach them. And I know how hard struggles. And I'm going to give you the examples. Charles gave an example. Alan gave an example. So deinstitutionalization was difficult because we cut money, but we didn't transfer it. So again, we have to just be cautious about the kinds of what seem like simplistic things, take from one and give from the other, rather than, as Alan said, looking at the bigger picture. If you want to know somebody who's worked in the police and made a huge transformation in the system, look at Sean Pica and Hudson Link. Sean Pica was a convicted felon, a murderer who came to social work school. We were at Silverman. He, as a white criminal, got favors. He recognized his privilege in Sing Sing and all the other state. He was in 10 prisons. He created something called Hudson Link, where with got 500 convicted felons their college degrees. It's called Hudson Link. And the recidivism rate when they got out, these convicted felons, is less than 10%. And he's making it, and guess what? There's a whole student unit that work with him in the prisons. Are we going to say get rid of. We can't work in criminal justice. We have big programs in probation. We can't, by ourselves, we're not ending this. We're not going to end this no matter what. So let's look at the code of ethics, what you're saying, and if we have to, but we have to practice our pronouncements. And we need to include, if we're talking about systemic reform, folks, we need to bring in more macro curricula to students who feel confident in those larger pictures and not just serving individuals.
Thank you, Terry. So I just want to acknowledge that there have been a lot of comments throughout this conversation on the feed that raised the issue of the NASW Code of Ethics, and including the word racism, anti-racism in the Code of Ethics. And I think that, this is something that you all have alluded to, talking about our Code of Ethics. And people have also, been talking about the fact that there is a basic sort of white supremacy foundation for social work. And this raises the question about the extent to which one white supremacist field can actually what's the word, anti-race, I'm stumbling over my words, but fix another system that is also a white supremacist system. And Alan, you brought up the fact that abolishing the police is on the continuum that Laura mentioned when she said defunding is a continuum. And we have about 15 minutes left, and I think one of the questions or one of the threads that I'd love for folks to comment on here as we start to wrap this up. Hopefully not the first time or the only time we will talk about this, but is this idea of, when we think about the NASW Code of Ethics, when we think about who all is making these statements, addressing the issue of who is defining who this is a problem for and how we move forward with this. And I say this because there are a lot of ideas that you all have thrown out there, and there are some people that are going to be wanting to leave with the answer, and there is not the answer, or at least we haven't come up with it yet. And so I would just really love for you all to talk about how we seize this moment. Laura, would you mind?
Sure. Yeah, I think that's exactly what I'm thinking about. When I get back to the original reason that Alan and I kind of put our heads together to put forth this statement is not really about these kind of individual situations. Like, sure, yes, you're Terry's example of a former, someone who was formerly incarcerated, working to help people in prisons. Yes, those individual examples are not necessarily what we're aiming to fix at the moment. I myself, my research has been in, juvenile justice and also prison and jail facilities. And so I've been on the inside and I understand that view. Our main point is that if NASW and allied organizations are speaking for our profession in these public forums, who is actually defining the discourse right now, right? Because we know that discourse matters and we know that words matter. Defund the police as a term is a discourse that matters, right? So where social work stands on this and what we say and who's speaking is also a defining moment. I do want to seize this moment in social work. I want to embrace this moment just as much as Terry and Charles do in terms of taking our stand and putting our stake here and saying we are on the side of Black Lives Matter and we support this policy platform. We support divesting and reinvesting. We don't know exactly what this is going to look like. We don't know exactly where things will end if we move toward defunding. But as what Miriam Kaba said in her New York Times article, When people, especially white folks, consider a world without police, they envision society as violent as our current one, merely without law enforcement. As a society, we've been so indoctrinated with the idea that we solve problems by policing and caging people that many cannot imagine anything other than prisons and the police as solutions to violence and harm. We call upon our profession to work with communities to envision solutions that do not involve violence and further harm. For example, restorative justice, which I think social work should embrace way more wholeheartedly than we do. I could go on, but I won't, and I'll turn it over to my colleagues here. But just to say that anyone can come up with the exception, the good cop, the program that works. Okay, but what we're talking about here is who and how are we claiming our position in this very historic time around racial justice as a profession. And that's what I'm mostly concerned about.
Thank you. Charles, I'm wondering if you'd like to respond. And also, as we come to the end of the hour that we have here, I'm wondering if you can talk about some of the next steps. Start us in on this, because I'd like everybody to share some ideas for next steps.
Thank you, Jonathan. And I'm glad you asked that specific question. I did my dissertation on incarceration. So I spent a lot of time looking at that system, and it needs to be undone. Too many people have had their lives ruined. Communities have been destroyed by policing and incarceration. So we have to address that issue. So, but for me, I'm going to get behind one policy for now, going forward, because we can't do it all. And the one thing that I really feel strongly about is taking police out of schools. Okay, taking the police out of the schools and taking those dollars and putting social workers in the schools. Congresswoman Janet Napolitano is the chair of the Congressional Mental Health Caucus. She has a bill that's been on laying there, and we're going to do a briefing on that bill in the fall, and we're going to encourage all social workers to get behind at least this one idea, and there are many more. Let's take the police out of the schools and put the social workers in the schools.
Excellent. Thank you. All right. And I will say that my friend Michael Kelly over at schoolsocialwork.net has been doing a lot of work on schools and policing or school resource officers. And so I think this is a really important place to start. Alan, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thanks. I'd say, in addition to defunding the police, I think in terms of next steps, our position is, Laura and I wrote a response to Terry and Charles and Darlene and Steve's letter that laid out different steps that people can take, from students to faculty to chairs, to get behind this movement. But in terms of a really concrete step, many of us are social work educators and in that space. So I wanted to talk about what we could do there, because it's come up a bit about the acknowledging the white supremacy and racism that exists within our own profession and within our own system. That's a place where I really think we need to start having much more conversations about, because I don't think we've done a good job of that historically. How many of our schools of social work talk about the fact that Black children and families were intentionally excluded from the settlement house movement? We talk about that movement all the time. Do we talk about how racist that movement was? The settlement house movement was created by white people to protect and uphold white people. Those are the kind of things that we need to start talking about in our profession. How many of our schools of social work talked about the fact that when Jane Addams spoke out against lynchings, she also implicitly justified it by calling Black men bestial? Those are the racist origins of our profession that we need to start talking about. And then how did those racist origins lead to the decades of policy development in our systems that produce the racist outcomes we see? I mentioned the child welfare system before, but I think that's an important one because it's largely filled by social workers, but it's a system that not only produces racist outcomes, but it's a system that we've known about that for decades, which really speaks to the deep problems we have in our profession. We've known for decades that the child welfare system causes immeasurable harm to Black children and families, and we've been unable as a profession to do anything about it. We really need to start looking critically at ourselves and what we do in our own systems of care before we think we can be any kind of solution anywhere else. It really has to start from within. And it could start by the education that we give our students so that they could really start grappling with the racist origins of our profession and how that led to, and in many ways maintains racism in our systems today.
Okay, so I'm the last one of the four. And I will say in a respectful way to Alan that many of us are teaching that. I want to just say that the kind of extreme, again, it comes back to what Alan sees more, I don't, as again, the either or we're teaching it or we don't. We're complicit or we have to be out. We have to start, I hope, with some reality that where we are as a profession, depending on how you define us, who's a social worker, I don't know who's listening. There's 150,000 NASW members. There are 450,000 licensed social workers. There are almost 1 million people who identify on the census that they are social workers by position who don't have a degree. So even if we want to go back to really basic, who's speaking for us? We cannot right now, the four of us are certainly not speaking for our profession. NASW has the bandwidth, I think, to reach out to thousands of social workers. Let's do the research. It's not a popularity contest, but let's find out whether Charles's view or whether Laura's view about how people feel about the safety of their communities and the roles. I'll end with a couple of things that I think, in addition to policy. Specific policies, there are specific bills. Our colleague Michael Sheridan and others have written a policy statement that talks about several things, several items that I think, again, we don't have to start from scratch. But the community is not monolithic. We all have to, including myself, be careful of these broad statements that social workers did this, social workers did that. We have the data. Some people teach it. We need more complete history. You know what? That's what the Black Lives Matters is saying now. All these laws are saying we're teaching an incomplete history about the Confederacy. So we agree with that. We agree we can put racism into the code of ethics. But here's what I think. For social workers who are in the system who are listening now, you could feel demoralized. I would like not to talk about the example, Laura, as an exception. I differ. I think that there are hundreds and thousands of social workers making a difference every day, unheralded, who need to share their stories. We need to replicate Hudson Link. We need to bring funds so that prisoners can get a college degree. They can't now. There are lots of things that are already models that we need to replicate. We need to showcase. And this is the opportunity. Social workers are finally going to be able to say, we have some things that work. Are we going to end racism in this society? Of course not. But we have a voice, we have vision, we have values, we have skills. You mentioned restorative justice. We do mediation. We do street gangs work. We do lots of things that I don't think the average person who's making policy understands. Getting a seat at the table doesn't mean compromise or co-optation, because we're going to always have those social workers and others at the door holding us honest. But nor should the people at the door say that the folks at the table don't understand what's going on in the community. We need to bring the voices from the community at the table with us.
Terry, I want to say thank you, and I want to thank Alan and Laura and Charles for this hour-long discussion that had the feed just full of energy and lots of ideas. I just wanted to point everyone back to the original articles that were written about this, to follow these folks on social media as they are engaging in these conversations all the time. And to continue, for those of you who are in schools of social work, continue to demand that we address the racism in our curriculum, that those of you that are in, all of us that are social workers that are in systems, be vigilant about who's being served by those systems, and to continue to have these conversations. So again, I just want to thank everyone so much for your time and your energy and your willingness to have this conversation.
It was spirited. It was terrific.
I'm Jonathan Singer, and thanks for being with me today for another episode of the Social Work Podcast. If you missed an episode or have suggestions for future episodes, please visit socialworkpodcast.com. If you'd like to support the podcast, please visit our online store at cafepress.com/swpodcast. To all the social workers out there, keep up the good work. We'll see you next time at the Social Work Podcast.